Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Dean's Forum lecture with Chris Reed. Thank you, Dean Berman, for your support for tonight's lecture and events. Chris Reed is founding director of Stoss Landscape Urbanism and is recognized internationally as a leading voice in the transformation of landscape and cities. Chris is particularly interested in the relationship between ecology and landscape and infrastructure, social spaces, and cities. Chris is the co-editor with Nina Marie Lister of Projective Ecologies and author of a wide array of papers and articles in leading publications across the globe. He is a recipient of the 2012 Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award in Landscape Architecture, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and a 2017 Mercedes T. Bass Landscape Architect in Residence at the American Academy in Rome. Chris received his MLA from the University of Pennsylvania. We forgive him for that. And an AB in Urban Studies from Harvard College. He is currently professor in practice of landscape architecture and co-director of the Master of Landscape Architecture in the Urban Design program at the GSD. With offices in Boston and Los Angeles, Stoss has pursued work that varies in scale, budget, and scope, and always delivered thoughtful, exploratory work that pushes the discipline to question itself and its role in a rapidly urbanizing world. Within every project, Chris leads Stoss to develop broader research questions that can be tested through built work and planning scenarios. Stoss's genesis in an array of formative projects have tested the theoretical underpinnings of landscape urbanism and socio-ecological design discourse, and this body of work that Chris helped to pioneer has become the foundation of our profession. I'm sure that Chris will present a wide array of projects, but one that I continue to be excited about is the Harvard Science Center Plaza. In Stoss's approach to the Science Center Plaza, the firm applies contemporary fabrication tools to produce seating that morphs through a range of ergonomic configurations, producing a designed flexibility and inclusion through form. In the same project, the dynamism of a central campus space is produced via programming. Through a highly crafted single plane that creates the plaza, it supports an infinite variety of uses. These are socio-ecological approaches that favor a broader range of users, experiences, and help to support a contemporary urban landscape. It is the careful and considerate implementation of highly theoretical concepts that allows Stoss to push the discipline of landscape architecture. With that being said, I'm sure Chris will have much more to say. Please join me in welcoming tonight's Dean's Forum lecture with Chris Reed.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me. Dean Berman, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to be in the company of so many friends. I always get very nervous when I come here because there are folks who have known me forever, like Beth Meyer. She claims I once slept outside her office door in a hallway at Gund Hall.
Not waiting for me, another professor.
That was a few years ago. But it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a hell of a place to get to. It took me about 20 hours today to get here. But I'm here. And I'm gonna experiment a little tonight. I've never given all of this talk, but I thought I'd share it with you. Share some new work, share a new project we're working on through the office, a project that Scott Mitchell, who's now a PhD student here, initiated with me. More generally, I want to talk about practice. We can lower the lights now, please. Thanks. I want to talk about practice and the changing nature of practice, the changing nature of our practice. I want to talk a bit about our work in its many dimensions. You all probably know us a little bit, I think, as a firm very much interested in the processes and operations and media of landscape and ecology, and how they may inform design thinking and the remaking and reimagining of cities and public spaces. We've explored this in many dimensions. We've made very deliberate ties to historical work, particularly the multidimensional work of Frederick Law Olmsted and others. And we've explored these ideas through various projects, very large-scale urban strategies, in places as diverse as Toronto and Dallas and Shanghai, and explored the idea of hybridized landscape infrastructures across the world and in places like LA as well. But the nature of work, public work especially, has changed dramatically in the last 18 years since I founded the practice. Environment and climate in particular are front and center, not only in our work, but in our daily lives. This is the king tide now in Boston, a very regular occurrence when the harbor overflows the banks downtown. Of course, there are many, many different forms of climate change and climate impact. Sometimes it's too much water, sometimes it's too little. Too little water then has effects, as you know, on water supply, food supply, and on the proliferation of wildfires that have ravaged parts of Southern California and Northern California in the last couple of years. But it's also a new world socially. Through changing demographics, changing perspectives, changing values, I guess. There are now a plurality of voices jostling for space within the public realm. And the question front and center for many of us is how to design for this. You know, I started the practice 18 years ago as one guy, but we've now evolved into a leadership team of four. Four people from radically different backgrounds, graphic design, different perspectives. We have footholds in two major American cities now, Boston and Los Angeles. Boston where it snows, Los Angeles where it never snows. And we have an expansive national and global network. We have an incredible group of multi-talented folks coming to work every day, running these projects, bringing their energies, their backgrounds, their perspectives, their values, their experiences to contribute not only to daily office life, but to the life of the projects that we take on. We're working with an increasingly diverse set of tools, everything from the research journal to the hard hat, to the 3D printer, to some pretty old school tools as well. And we make stuff like this. And we do things like this to study our own work as we begin to develop it. But really from the start, my interest has been in the application of ideas into the real world through projects. For me, I have a keen interest in the life of landscape, the life of public spaces, the living, breathing, and constantly changing aspects of city life. We're especially interested in the everyday life of the city, the normalcies, the day-to-day, the stuff we just do, or landscapes just do, or can be made to do, but rendered in ways that make them extraordinary. This isn't just about landscapes that can do lots of things environmentally, ecologically, socially, economically, though those things are really important. But this is about an idea about landscapes that simultaneously contribute to the social and cultural imagination, to a bigger cultural project. This work that you're seeing, these images, are by photojournalist Mike Bellamy. It's a project we're temporarily calling Work Life, where we're interested in capturing the tensions and joys and myriad everyday experiences and qualities of life in the city, of life in our work, in the lives and afterlives of urban landscapes. This is the part of the work tonight that I've never presented before. You're seeing a preview of what I hope to be a book or two that will emerge in the coming year or so. Mike's gone out in many of the places that we work and in many of the projects we've done to capture essential qualities of those places. Increasingly, we're working in places like this, places that have been altered from one form of life to another, many of them now in waiting for yet another form of life to come. Sometimes we get commissions at well-established institutions, but oftentimes we're dealing with the leftover infrastructural spaces of the city, places that are empty or abandoned, places that are in a radical state of transition. This is a high school in Venice, in Los Angeles. Neighborhoods that are in transition. These transitions are at once environmental, social, economic, racial. We're dealing with some pretty tough physical conditions, but some pretty extraordinary social conditions and otherwise. And in this work, we're trying to find opportunities for new generations and new voices to be recognized in the work, to be meaningfully brought into conversations about the future, a future that is really at our doorstep. Again, sea level rise conditions in Boston, and a photo of Los Angeles, a place with a scarcity of water. These are the folks that we work with on a day-to-day basis. These are the folks that we design for in our practice. These are the folks that we consult, that we bring into the conversation on their terms, not ours. And these are some of the folks we hope will be here as the work plays itself out over the coming years. We do stuff like this to engage them, to draw in new audiences. Typically, these engagements are incredibly active and deep and sustained. Again, we're trying to begin to interact with people in ways that they're not sitting in a room on our terms, but are given opportunities to come into a space, to participate in something, to do something of their own making. Oftentimes that involves events and activities on sites that really invite people into a place to use it in ways that they have never used it before, or perhaps have never really had access to or felt welcome to in their past lives. We build things like this for badasses like her. As a way to allow people to just experiment, to take things apart, to reassemble things, to find their own way of navigating space, landscape, and the city. More and more, we're shifting our emphasis to getting projects realized. We've got over a half dozen projects from coast to coast under construction now. We're very much interested in these, certainly for their physical form, but more importantly for the social and ecological lives that they may prompt and respond to. Through this, we've had the opportunity to realize a number of projects as well over the last few years. And you can see images of them here. Projects that are really diverse from a typological standpoint, from the standpoint of geography or setting. But most important to us, projects that have a life and an afterlife after we leave, that allow people to begin to inhabit and appropriate those spaces and take them on as they will for themselves. I think it's important to say in all this that this isn't an interest in the social life of urban spaces minus the design. It's very much a conversation about how design might prompt these these various activities, these various lives and responses within the public realm, and what the interaction between a carefully carved and staged and designed urban landscape might be, and the life and activity that may ensue from it. And so what I want to do is really talk in 3 chapters tonight. I want to represent 3 projects that you may already know, 3 built projects, showing you some of the work that Mike and I have been putting together around this topic of work-life. Chapter 2 is more of a detour into a conversation on water, on the many waters that might be considered as a creative and imaginative medium, material, and phenomenon at the heart of much of our work. And chapter 3 is a deeper dive into 2 of our very recent projects, a large-scale park project in Boston and a competition winning scheme for a 20-mile greenway in St. Louis, both of which take on agendas of social and racial equity within the context of very public landscape projects. So first, to continue with this line of the social and the design, I've always been fascinated by people. William White, of course, did his study on the social lives of urban spaces and noted that people will pretty much figure out how to use a space even if it hasn't been designed for them. These 2 ladies, of course, have found their own space wedged between 2 cars. They could have been eating their lunch inside the cafe or on the street, and yet they chose to resist and find their own way of making their way in the world. That sense of curiosity, that sense of inventiveness, is something very much at the heart of our work and very much related to a couple site-scale projects that we've been involved in. First at Harvard University, Brad mentioned this. He already gave you the nice overview of it, so I don't have to fully explain it. A university and city crosswords designed for flexibility at the scale of the human body and at the scale of this urban space. These custom-made benches were designed really to respond, to offer choice and flexibility to people. In the same way that you're all sitting in these slightly uncomfortable chairs in different ways, we wanted to design furniture using some of the fabrication software and technologies that we have that might accommodate people in different ways. And in the same way to set up the plaza, to have a series of rotating activities and events that could be installed and reinstalled on the plaza over the course of its life. The work here is very much about the everyday. It's a tension between the everyday uses of a space, a campus space, just simply the act of walking through, sitting down, hanging out, studying, or sometimes these really incredible, intense moments of pure pleasure, pure joy, really experiencing urban life in ways not previously possible within a space like this. A lot of this programming we started to script out in advance, but so much of it has really been invented after we left. So what we did was set up this stage for appropriation for others to begin to create their own ways of working with the thing that we had designed. The second project at the University of Michigan, a 4-acre campus quad that's been refigured. It's centered, it's within the center of the engineering school complex. And here we responded to the dean's call to really make a place to expand the social lives of students, to offer release, respite, opportunities for play and playful work out within the landscape. At core, it's a circulatory strategy and a grading strategy to create places of difference. But again, we're interested in the seating device, both as a product of fabrication technologies, but also as a prompt for how it works with other parts of the landscape to set up new kinds of physical and social conditions that allow people to inhabit the space in ways that they hadn't previously. And it's set up so that there are many different kinds of places to choose from. Places where you're comfortable being alone, but can flex out to accommodate very large groups of people. And it's a place for experimentation. A lot of the engineers will now bring their robots and research out into the landscape to make that part of the play and experimentation that happens out there. This is a Mars rover, and this was the only landscape they could find on campus to experiment with. And then the third project, the City Deck in Green Bay, Wisconsin, a city-scale public space and civic infrastructure, all developed from this very simple folding wood gesture that sets up a whole series of new conditions, both on the upland and over the water, and has really catalyzed a whole series of different kinds of occupations for the playing out of civic and collective life. I think with all this work is very much an interest, again, in the relationship between the physical and the designed world, and that which ensues. I'm also, as you see, very much interested in the photojournalist aspect of Mike's work, documenting the reality of these places once we as designers leave the room. All right, chapter 2, water. No doubt water's central to the ways landscape designed and otherwise work and thrive. The ways in which water can inspire pure joy in people, inspire playfulness in folks, a letting down of the guard, a sheer exuberance in the ways that we engage the environment through design projects, no matter the season or the multiple forms of water we encounter. But I'd like to talk about water and the potential of water in different ways. In H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness, Ivan Illich describes the magical stuff that is water, not the engineered and cleansed systems of drinking water and storm water and toilet water that sustain us in the city of today, but the mysterious, shape-shifting, primordial waters of the pre-Enlightenment that fully embodied rich material qualities and cultural projections. Illich regrets this loss and argues for the recovery of water as something not so fully defined and scientific, something that is more suggestive, more sensual, and perhaps beyond our full control or comprehension. While paying homage to Gaston Bachelard, Water and Dreams, on the potentialities of those more mystical connections, Illich writes, quote, "Water throughout history has been perceived as the stuff which radiates purity. H2O is the new stuff on whose purification human survival now depends. H2O and water have become opposites. H2O is a social creation of modern times, a resource that is scarce and that calls for technical management. It's an observed fluid that has lost the ability to mirror the water of dreams. The city child has no opportunity to come in touch with living water. Water can no more be observed, it can only be imagined by reflecting on an occasional drop or a humble puddle." Now, Joseph Brodsky in Watermark, writing in an entirely different context, hints at the potentials of what Illich recalls. Here the narrator has just emerged from the main rail station in Venice and embarks on a gondola. Quote, "It was a windy night, and before my retina registered anything, I was smitten by a feeling of utter happiness. My nostrils were hit by what to me has always been its synonym, the smell of freezing seaweed. For some people, it's freshly cut grass or hay. For others, Christmas scents of conifer needles and tangerines. For me, it's freezing seaweed. And this, he goes on, there is something primordial about traveling on water, even for short distances. You're informed that you are not supposed to be there, not so much by your eyes, ears, nose, palate, or palm, as by your feet, which feel odd acting as an organ of sense. Water unsettles the principles of horizontality, especially at night, when its surface resembles pavement. No matter how solid its substitute, the deck under your feet, on water, you are somewhat more alert than on shore. Your faculties are more poised. Now, even in an age of rapid climate change and of the need for almost continuous and instant gratification, I think our work at Stoss tends to look beyond the merely functional and beyond the purely spectacular. While we fully acknowledge the important ecological and functional roles water plays in our lives, we also look to transcend the pragmatics of water flows and functions of sustainability and environmental awareness, and admit more of the experiential, the immersive, the sensorial, even the poetic aspects of water in all its forms and phenomena. A few projects to demonstrate this interest. First in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, along the port, an area undergoing rapid redevelopment. A site that was a former marsh at one point, filled for infrastructure and industry. Here the interest was in reinaugurating the dynamic cycles of the environment and of water through very simple planting of a grove that gave way to an open lawn and that stepped down to a wetland terrace that we reinaugurated here. The interest here was in redirecting on-site water systems, yes, to establish new ecologies, but more to reinaugurate environmental dynamics through the sustaining qualities and sheer presence of water, giving space back to water in the city. And you can see we did this in two ways. First, by allowing it to capture storm water, and second, by allowing river water to enter the space and reclaim its place on the site. These new ecological functions are expressed through the very changing nature of the plant material in that part of the plaza, and in new forms of life that are given place, new flows, new experiences, new creatures brought to life in this previously forgotten place. And that Michigan quadrangle, again, an important aspect of this project was to capture 95% of the storm water on site through a series of very large retention basins on site. Here, this feature project utilizes interactive technologies to connect people to the natural cycles and dynamics of water. Lush, shady stormwater gardens of soft ferns and prickly larch incorporate an interactive lighting feature that flickers in response to stormwater entering the garden, thus amplifying and transforming this function into a dramatic new experience of the space, rendering a mostly miserable, cold, and wet moment into an experience of utter beauty. Finding ways through technology to make direct connections between people and the environment. And then in Toronto, a project called Cloud Park. Here was an attempt to play on the various manifestations of water and fog and ice and mist at a place where land and city meet water. The goal here was to create a park that plays with and plays off of environmental phenomena. That creates experiences that are dynamic, often ephemeral and multisensory, that are sometimes truly extraordinary in the sensations and experiences they produce, such as rich juxtapositions of frozen ice, warm steam, and human flesh, and that work at the scale of the city to signal a new set of social relationships to an ever-changing, potentially ever-mystical environment. Even in Boston, with the challenges of climate change and the opportunities to rethink our formerly active industrial waterfronts and ports, water plays an important role. Here, I think there are bigger opportunities which might in turn change people's perceptions of the role of the environment in the city and of the global climate. Projects that attempt, like at the New England Aquarium, to re-engage people with diurnal, lunar, and seasonal cycles, while at the same time creating a living laboratory for experiencing and learning about urban ecology and climate change at the heart of the city. And projects like at an old power plant that expose people to the sometimes brute forces and overwhelming power and majesty of the sea, and to do it in ways that people can physically touch and feel and experience to their core. For us, water is very much medium and canvas. It is multi-sensory and ever fleeting. Our efforts are to enhance, to engage in its life-giving and imaginative powers, to recognize that the imagination and physical forces of water are both bigger than us and always out of reach. These are living, breathing waters, physical and phenomenal, sensory and sensual, forceful and ephemeral, reflective and immersive, mystical and imaginary, potentially new embodiments of cultural projections and of our dreams. The writer Graham Swift observes, when you work with water, you have to know and respect it. When you labor to subdue it, you have to understand that one day it may rise up and turn all your labors to nothing. For what is water, which seeks to make all things level, which has no taste or color of its own, but a liquid form of nothing? I hope I'm not too gloomy. All right, a nice color image for you. Wake everybody up. Chapter 3, I want to talk about a couple contemporary landscape projects where we're being asked to take on agendas of social, racial, and economic equity. In part, I think, to make up for sins of the past, but in part to project a richer, fuller, and more dynamic idea of what it means to be inclusive, to be human, and to be urban, fully engaged with the environment, with the city, and with each other, all of each other. First project is Moakley Park in Boston, very much an equity strategy in the guise of a climate adaptation project. On the harbor front of Boston, an existing image of the site. Here, once a salt marsh and mud flat, this site has had multiple lives. Salt marsh, a dump, a playground. It's been filled at numerous times over the course of its life, capped with soil, capped with sand for a beach. It was also very much brimming with life for many parts of its existence. It's now a place that's quite troubled. It's already subject to stormwater flooding, a result of the increasing volume and frequency of rain in the area, in combination with the land settling. And it's projected to be one of the entry points as sea levels rise that will inundate Boston, both existing neighborhoods, very poor neighborhoods, that live in existing social housing developments, and also through this route to the back to some new development opportunities that will be opened up in the very near future. It's a it's a park that's hard to get to. It's 60 acres, and if you count the parkways and the beach around it, it's a total of 90 acres right on the harborfront, thereby Boston's largest harborfront beach, and yet it's a place that you can't get to, given the proliferation of automobile infrastructure. Once you get there, there's pretty much one or two things to do. Play sports. This was very much an active sports park for much of its life. 55% of the ground is taken up by active sports fields, and you can see, because of their arrangement, all of the space in between is pretty much left over and useless in many ways. And so this is a park on the edge of a number of very needy neighborhoods, needy in terms of needing access to the water. It's a place within 2 blocks of 2 different public transit stops, and yet the only reason to go here is to play sports. And so it's not a very good destination park, and at the same time, it's not a very good neighborhood park as well. And yet, it has incredible potential. It's a 10 to 15 minute ride from the most diverse range of Boston's neighborhoods. A kid from the middle of Roxbury or Dorchester could get here within 10 minutes and have direct access to the waterfront. But right now, there's no reason for them to go there, and there's no safe route to get them there as well. So we see this as an enormous opportunity. It's why we staged this day called Moakley Day. You saw some of these photographs afterwards, to introduce new activities and to invite people who had never been invited into the park to come, to enjoy themselves, to explore different ways of experiencing the park and the harborfront. And so the goal with this project is to make it a multifunctional urban waterfront for all of Boston, a better community park, a better sports park, a missing link in the Emerald Necklace of Boston, and one of which really addresses head-on some of the climate issues that are at stake, but also some of the social equity issues that have ravaged Boston for decades. At base level, the project is designed to help contain, with a series of other coastline measures, projected inundation from sea level rise over a period of time. Here, because we have space within the park, we're actually allowing that water to enter the park and take over bigger areas along the waterfront. Here you can see a projection of how that might work over time. That's not a permanent condition. That's what would happen during a storm. The resilience strategy here is really threefold. One, it's to protect from coastal inundation. Second, it's to create on-site storage of stormwater. And third, importantly, it's to reintroduce diverse and dynamic ecologies to this place, and also, in doing so, to counter the effects of the urban heat island within the city. It's a spectacular waterfront site, one of which will continue to function for some of the sports activities that are already present, but one of which will invite new uses and introduce new programs to attract a more diverse set of user groups to the site. Programming is one of the key ways in which we can invite other groups of people into the park to use the park in different ways. So whether it's large-scale barbecue areas or different kinds of sport and activity programs, or simply easy ways to get across the streets and to get direct access to this new waterfront. It's a combination strategy that allows for people to experience the waterfront in new ways. The Waterfront Promenade here will really be an enhancement to the beach. It will replace an active automobile route that separates the park from the waterfront. The waterfront itself will be programmed with different kinds of activities, basketball courts and picnic areas, an event plaza, and a half-mile-long public promenade to really invite people in. The park itself will have floodable sports courts, hidden play areas within the upland forest woodland, and it will have continue to have sports fields that flex out to allow other kinds of uses and activities over the course of the year and the various seasons. It's a park that, on the one hand, is part of the mayor's new initiative on resilience to protect Boston from sea level rise and climate inundation. But it's the first project within that series to really take on issues of providing access to a wide diversity of Boston residents and to give part of the harborfront back to Boston citizenship. The second project is in St. Louis, and this was a competition that we won last spring and have just started in on some of the work going forward. There's a lot happening in St. Louis these days. There are a lot of good people thinking good things. You may know St. Louis for the Arch. You may know St. Louis for some of its cultural and art institutions and its public art. It's got some amazing assets in the performing arts. It's got Forest Park, renovated arch grounds, and a whole series of different pockets of the city that are really quite active and vibrant. And yet it's a city that's lost an enormous chunk of its population over the last 50 years and have left some neighborhoods looking like this, with high rates of vacancy and blight. Low levels of investment that have recurred over many years. And yet it's also a city that's really quite rich. If you move beyond the sort of first layer of assets and well-known destinations, you find a city that has an active and vibrant rail history, a rail yard right in the middle of the city. You have a whole series of former industrial sites, some of which are now being renovated, being brought back to life. You have a whole series of infrastructural sites where the opportunity for encounters with how the city works in some pretty intriguing places are really ripe to be tapped. It's also a city, as you probably know, that's been at the heart of a lot of race issues and race relations. This is the courthouse that settled the Dred Scott case that took citizenship away from freed slaves when they moved back into slaveholding states. This is on the left, the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood, a predominantly African-American neighborhood that was wiped out with urban renewal to make way for highways and for part of the mall that leads down to the Gateway Arch. On the other hand, St. Louis was one of the first cities to integrate its public pool system on the left. Fortunately, on the right, that caused a whole series of fairly violent race riots that ensued after the pools were open. It's a very contentious set of issues. You, of course, know the story of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and it's a set of issues that are really felt day to day within the fabric and life of the city. interestingly enough, it's a landscape project that was asked to solve some of these problems, or at least to start to address some of these problems, to take on these issues head on. I kind of laughed when we were presenting. I made a joke that it was almost like they were asking us to solve all the social, racial, and economic problems of St. Louis through the development of a greenway. And yet they kind of were, and they kind of still are. And that's what makes it, for me, an incredibly important and promising project, that landscape projects like this can really take on some of these important social and racial issues. I want to show you, we're in the middle of the work now. So I'm going to show you a little bit of work from the competition, enhanced a little bit from our current research. What you're seeing is going to be revised, redesigned in many ways, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what we're up to, starting with Dee and Damon. This was from the competition presentation itself. To get a sense for some of the starting points. The team is really a diverse group of designers and artists and engineers and entrepreneurs and economic development specialists and scientists and the like, all who have a sense of what rebounding American cities are like, and all of whom have been involved in projects where racial and social justice are intentional outcomes. In the project, we were asked to really look at this corridor from east to west, from Forest Park to the Arch Grounds, really developing a series of connections to some of the more beloved destinations of St. Louis. Our team took the initiative to really look beyond that, to begin to identify other kinds of treasures throughout the city and other places, particularly to the north and south, that would allow for a much more inclusive and expansive understanding of what the city is about. I think it's also important to understand that St. Louis is an incredibly racially divided city. When you look at demographic maps, there's a line that exists just above Washington Street here. And pretty much everyone who lives north of that is African American or black, and folks who live south of that are white. And so breaking this divide was absolutely critical. Bringing to light the stories and traditions of all of St. Louis residents was also very much part of the idea here. We're asking bigger questions. How can the Greenway bring to light an expansive understanding of our city, who we are as a people? Certainly looking at the heart of St. Louis, many of its beloved assets, but expanding that sense of what's important here by looking at some of the soul and grit of St. Louis, the city's character and authenticity. Asking questions like how the natural cultural resources, cultural traditions of St. Louis can be tapped as touchstones for the arts, for design, and for navigating the city. Really looking at those things that are common to all of us, the earth, the environment, and water on the one hand, but also telling lost or hidden stories, bringing to light the very things that make us distinct socially and culturally, and giving those things equal value within the public realm. And really adding to the diversity of attractions and different aspects of the city that are really already well known. The project, very simply, was the Loop and the Stitch. We started with the prompt of connecting east to west, Forest Park to the Arch, green to green, but quickly asked ourselves if this was enough. So we looked north and south, recognizing 4 parks, not 2, and a host of residents and neighborhoods often overlooked. This expanded array of assets were then to be knitted together, east and west with the Loop, north and south with the Stitch, creating a newly connected, mobile, and accessible St. Louis. The Loop and the Stitch very much embodied our intention to promote connection, prosperity, inclusion, reconciliation, innovation, and joy. The Loop, east, west, and green here, links the civic and spectacular icons and histories of the central city, connecting Washington University and Forest Park to downtown St. Louis and the Gateway Arch. The Stitch, the 2 pink lines moving north and south, links neighbors to neighbors and the visitor to the everyday authenticity of St. Louis. It connects Fairground Park in the north through Grand Center and the St. Louis University campuses to Tower Grove Park in South St. Louis. Very quickly, I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail. The civic spine is really creating a new greenway from civic green to civic green, expanding a right-of-way or a median in a right-of-way to create a very green boulevard that links the park to the Arch Grounds right through the heart of the city. It also includes, importantly, the Mill Creek Valley project. Project site is an extension of that Gateway Mall that starts at the Arch and extends west. Spectacular spine follows the infrastructural and rail corridor to the south, linking the park first with this fantastic land bridge over a highway interchange that connects the city directly into Forest Park, then through a series of more infrastructural and industrial kinds of spaces, creating new gathering spaces at the heart of new investment areas and economic development zones where east and west meet north and south, repurposing highway interchanges and portions of the highway itself for new pedestrian and bicycle oriented uses, and converting old rail yards into lively and vibrant new prairies. We also introduced at the eastern end of this a new park that really offered new opportunities to invite kids down to the waterfront to be able to use and inhabit the waterfront in different kinds of ways. And then third, the everyday spine, going north-south. This was an idea that connected all the way along Grand, but importantly linked kids to their schools, parents to their work, and sought to reunite different communities and neighbors that were here. Here, investment is made in different forms through a vacant lot toolkit that brings new social and ecological life to the neighborhoods, and to a whole series of different activation programs centered on areas of activity that already exist, but that look to seed new forms of life into some neighborhoods that haven't seen investment in many, many decades. I won't go through this. We're looking for different ways in which to commemorate some of the cultural traditions, some of the different landscapes that have existed. We're very much interested in issues of ecology and sustainability, in interactive technologies that allow for people, again, to interact differently with the environment. We're very much invested in engaged activation and public art programmings, leveraging common cultural experiences, and again, unearthing the histories, the hidden histories of this place. Overall, the idea is to create fantastic new experiences of the city, watching the sunset over Forest Park, commuting home from work along the Tetno Prairie, going down North Grand, lined by orchards, to the pump track and sports park at Choteau Landing, and from a morning market on Cherokee North to the revitalized Foundry for lunch. The idea here was to reconnect 18 different neighborhoods within St. Louis, to use the Greenway in a series of investment strategies throughout the city to begin to take on some of these important social, cultural, and economic issues that have been play in the city for many, many decades. This hopefully will be St. Louis reconnected and newly energized, open to and inclusive for all. Just to wrap up, again with this image, in an era of climate change, rapid urbanization, social and economic inequities, and rancorous cultural debate, life persists. Optimistically, the public realm has become a refuge for a truly civic life, for the multiple expressions of individuality, of difference, of commonality, of inclusivity, of personal and collective freedom. And yet it still remains a place where we can all just be ourselves. It is also potentially the best place to amplify and witness the changes happening in our environment and in the world around us. For us, the urban landscape is both platform and prompt, a forum for playing out the rituals of daily and civic life, both social and ecological, and a probe that stimulates interactions of many sorts. Through our work, we simply hope to sustain and extend these tendencies and ambitions. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. There is a microphone that will be passed around if you have comments or questions. Feel free to critique.
Hi, thanks so much for a great talk. It was really refreshing to see these photos that Mike took of the life of these sites, because I think so often I'm seeing these renderings of the projected life of sites, and it can be a little misleading to how it might actually play out.
Yep.
But my question had to do with the community engagement that a lot of your projects take on. And I was just wondering, logistically, how does that happen in your office? Is that, you know, a position within your office that manages those events, or do you partner with local organizations, or is that just very different case to case?
Both and. There are folks in the office who take on these. They're usually part of the project teams that are already working. But none of it works unless you do have good partner organizations on the ground that can do a little bit of the groundwork. And through them, we can kind of extend communication networks to begin to really reach out to people in ways that we cannot. But I think a lot of this is stepping outside of what would normally be called public process in a normal project, to really find ways to, as I said, to draw people in a way that they haven't been drawn in before. In St. Louis, the work we're doing is really to establish an understanding of the landscape of partners and potential partners, organizations that are out there. We don't want to introduce ideas that aren't going to then carry on. This is particularly important when you're dealing in neighborhoods that haven't seen investment, in some of the poorer African-American neighborhoods in North St. Louis. We're interested in understanding the folks who are already doing work and the way in which we can amplify that work, inject it with new life, find ways to add revenue and resources to the work that we're doing, and really scale it up to do something that has more meaningful impact at the urban scale and more physical impact throughout some of those neighborhoods. But we're not trying to go to people and say, hey, we have this idea about what you should do. We're trying to figure out what's going on the ground and really kind of amplify those tendencies and use those as a starting point for design. Beth Meyer. You have to wait for a microphone.
So interested, Chris, in what you're learning from Mike's photos. And it may be that you don't know yet.
Yeah. I don't know yet.
There's two kinds, right? He's gone back to work you've already done.
Yeah.
So can you share with us a couple things you didn't realize about the work you've already done that you saw through his photos? So,
yeah, and let me tell you too what I asked him to do to start. You know, I was very much interested in somehow documenting all of the various aspects of the work we do. Life in the office, the various parts of projects through their various stages, the various people that are involved, and the places we work. In many cases, those are places where we've done planning work or have work that hasn't yet been realized. And in other places, it's photographing projects that have been completed, that have been out there living on their own from anywhere from 1.5 years to 5, 6 years. to really see what's going on. We had the advantage early on a project I didn't show you, a little garden installation up in Grand Métis, Quebec, at the Garden Festival. That was a poured-in-place rubber surface that people began to play in. And the construction manager photographed what was going on in that place for us. So, you know, we have one or two images from the official garden photographer. That's a couple people probably staged running through the place. And yet we have all these other images of people doing handstands and fathers playing with their kids and you know, a life that we couldn't have imagined existed. And so it was with that idea that we went into the project. And I thought, you know, to on the one hand, to really get a cross-section of the country, of places in transition, because all the places that we're working in are in some form of transition or another. To find ways to thread through some of the common tensions and challenges within contemporary American cities, and also to find their differences. So we've had him out to Los Angeles, St. Louis, he'll go down to Galveston, he's been up to Green Bay, Detroit, Ann Arbor, Milwaukee, Boston, East Boston, Cambridge a couple times. There is a piece where, so the simple answer to your question is I still don't know. I mean, some of these photos came in 2 days ago and some of them came in 2 weeks ago. So I'm still trying to process them and try to figure them out in my own head. I think in some ways, the things that we're finding are common to some of these cities is pretty interesting. Some of the tensions, some of the ways he captures people's faces and the kind of emotions, whether it's a happy emotion or tension, I think is quite riveting. The kind of everyday life of places like this, images like that, just sweet little moments, everyday moments of you walking through a place with somebody that you love, right? Those are never captured typically in architectural glamour photos. And it reveals to me a sense of the ongoing life of a place in ways that we sort of imagined, but never fully did. I'm not fully answering your questions because again, I'm still processing it. And it's like 5,000 photographs at this point. But I do think, you know, for me, it's just revealing something about qualities of urban life today that's an important insight, I think, for not just us, but I think for designers, anybody working in the public realm, that ultimately this is the kind of life, that's going on out there, but also the kinds of lives and activities that the work can aspire to. And I think it's at that sort of cross between a real world, you know, everyday aspect of what we do and the ambition of what we do that these photographs somehow are finding their place. What else? Lena?
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
In the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned about the current, today's modes of practice in landscape architecture and what the new modes of landscape architectural practice might be. So my question has to do with the second half, for example, the new modes of practice. What do you think will be the kind of the opportunities or challenges in the next years to come in the landscape architecture in terms of the practice modes? At the same time, the kind of crossroad between the academia and then the practice as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, when I started the practice, I talked about moving beyond the realm of just landscape or the state of landscape as it was probably back in the 90s, right? To to use landscape as a way to open up toward bigger infrastructural issues, urban issues, that landscape could kind of provide a leading role. To do that, we needed to be entrepreneurial ourselves. We needed to look at the ways that research, academia, and practice could all intersect, and I think they do, and they have been doing that. I think as we move forward, the role of advocacy is really important. We're not always being asked to do what I'm telling you we're doing, right? Although sometimes we are. I think the way that we get into the mix on helping clients figure out how to do these projects, thinking very strategically about expanding sets of resources, about political stage setting, about reaching out ourselves to potential partners and funders for projects, to think about the ways in which certain aspects of the projects could be included or designed to appeal toward various funding opportunities that are out there. It's really looking at a much wider, vaster array of issues than I had ever imagined we would be doing. Partly because so much of our work isn't about simply being commissioned by an institution or a benefactor that has a lot of resources to begin. It's work that tends to be more in the public realm, where we need to bring to the table a set of ideas, not only about what that place could be, but how it is that we could work with that client group and its various partners to get to a place where they've never been before. That ends up consuming a lot of our time and attention. And then the ways in which that we reach out and actively engage people too has become such a core part of the practice and so necessary in order to execute some of the work or move it forward.
My question was pretty simple. What's your favorite part of the projects? Is it the ideation phase and researching what needs to be solved and how to solve it and what's really happening? Or is it seeing it actually being built and seeing it come to life? Or is it the aftermath of seeing how people use your ideas and make something new?
There's the instant gratification of seeing when it's being built. That's pretty cool. I won't deny that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the things we really have control over are the things that we're shaping and specking out. And I remember when Harvard opened, they were sort of installing it on a piecemeal basis, and parts of the site were constantly open to pedestrian traffic moving through. But the day they unwrapped the benches, a university administrator called me immediately and said, "We just unwrapped the benches, and Chris, they're using the benches in the same way that you drew them." Like, yeah, no kidding, right? And it was a fight to get them to get there, right? That was a particularly gratifying moment that you know, these weren't just weird-looking things that were done for the sake of our ego, that there was an idea behind them about how people could occupy a public space in ways that they hadn't been invited to do so previously. That was pretty rewarding. And then everything that's come since then is pretty rewarding. I mean, it's pretty good to see lines that you've drawn start to manifest themselves in a bigger landscape. But to see, you know, the look on people's faces as they begin to realize new opportunities for themselves is equally pretty cool. And, you know, I mean, I said this before, I want to say it again. This isn't about social design or community design. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm not a community advocate. We don't do community design. I don't even really know what that is. This is about design interacting with all these different forces and all these different things that are in play, right? And finding a path forward where design can be informed, and no matter what your audience or neighborhood or community is, that there's a absolute high-level aspiration and quality to the design work that you do, to the talent that you bring as an individual or a collective office that pairs up with all those other issues that allow for a project to go forward. There's one back there.
So you just mentioned that for the water, it's kind of a cultural protection. So I'm curious about, so in a design process, where we need to include the different attitude and concerns from the from different groups. The groups, I mean, maybe different races, different cultural background, different age groups, or people with different jobs. So how would you think about that when different forces weaving together in the project?
I mean, I think in public work, it's about having conversations with people, and the deeper you go in the conversations, the more that you learn. We just learned, as iconographic as the arches in St. Louis, not a single African American was allowed to work on that project. And so for some communities within the city to continually project and reproject that image is in some ways hurtful, or at least not positive, right? We're also learning about cultural traditions of brick making, for instance, in St. Louis, that may or may not have influence over the way in which we think about work. We're actively having conversations with an artists of color group that are constantly informing the research. Some of the research that you saw there was because we're having these conversations with people from different backgrounds, not the people that normally show up to an evening open house or something, but we're actively seeking those other voices that we know exist. And by incorporating people like Dee and Damon and Mallory on our team, we then have an embedded starting point for reaching out to those other voices and other networks that we know aren't being brought to the table. And so it'll depend on each community that you're working in, but for us that becomes the start of a healthy series of design conversations that ultimately can help inform the work that we're doing. Take one more.
So I had another question, sorry. So I was wondering when and what really kind of propelled you to start your own practice, and how that was, whether you felt any regret immediately, or if just
Should I?
talk me through it, because I'm sure it's probably a lot more overwhelming than it would be working for somebody else. So what kickstarted that? Was that always a dream?
Wow. That's a while ago. I mean, ultimately, I had some great jobs. I worked at a great firm. I worked at Hargraves Associates for 6 years. I was doing complex urban waterfront parks and work at the University of Cincinnati and work on the Clinton Library. I mean, the work was pretty amazing. But ultimately, I felt constrained within somebody else's office. I knew I learned a lot, was able to advance my own thinking. But one of the things that happened in that office is every time contingency was brought into play, every time the unexpected happened, it was a bit of a crisis, because so much of that firm's work dealt with sculptural form and composition, fairly traditional issues about how you arrange space and form, but at a radically different scale. And when these unforeseen events or impositions or circumstances arose, it always created crisis. The projects and the office struggled to deal with uncertainty and the unknown. And for me, that was becoming more commonplace than the things that we were doing, right? And so this issue of how can you develop project strategy that had a very clear set of logics and component parts to them, but was set up in order to continually respond to some of the ongoing inputs and circumstantial changes that occur through the design process of a project, but also extended through the life of the project as well. That became an interest, and it was something that was just not at the center of what that office was doing. So yeah, I just went on my own. I didn't really have money at the time. I married a lawyer. Charles Waldheim has always called her the business plan. And had a kid at the same time that I founded the office, and just kind of went from there. Didn't take any projects with me, just was optimistic and naive and thought I could get something rolling. It's taken 18 years. I think Boston just discovered that we exist 3 years ago, 15 years into our existence. We're finally getting a lot of work in Boston, which was never my hope. I mean, my hope was always to have a firm that practiced nationally and internationally, that wasn't regional, that wasn't locked into regional aesthetics or taste or any set of issues. It was really to practice globally to the extent that we could. Do I regret it? No, fuck no. It's been okay. Leave it there?